On December 24, 1965, two York Presbyterian congregations made national history by becoming one of only 3 interracial mergers during the Civil Rights Movement. But what made the merger of Faith and First Presbyterian particularly unique was the fact that the newly called pastor of Faith was a personal friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose counsel he had sought before deciding to accept the call to this black congregation as their pastor. In addition, only 9 months before the famous Christmas Eve merger, Reverend Douglas G. Parks would march with John Lewis on Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, and eventually with both King and Lewis on to Montgomery. There is no doubt you will want to hear Doug's compelling story told in this special 3-part series of Hey First Pres, What's Up? Hi, welcome to this special episode of Hey First Pres, What's Up? And I'm Guy Dunham, your host once again. I have to tell you, we are not at First Presbyterian in York. We are actually located at a beautiful resort called Lake Maury Resort in Fairleigh, Vermont. And the reason why we're here is because my very, very special guest, Reverend Doug G. Parks, is actually up here visiting family and friends. And we heard he was going to be here on the East Coast. He actually lives in California. And I said to Susan, how would you like to make a trip to New England? Which she jumped on it right away. And she's now my camera person today, by the way, folks. And so Doug graciously offered to find a place for us to meet. And we ended up here at this resort. Thank you so much, Doug. This is awesome to be here. We couldn't do it outside at the lake. There's too much background noise and a lot of folks around here, as they should be at a resort. So we do have a private room that they have provided for us here at the resort. And so it's so good to have you with us today. Hope that you'll enjoy what I believe is going to be a tremendously exciting and informative podcast here with Doug. Let me give you a little background if you're not familiar with who Doug is. He's a retired ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA, a graduate of Colgate University and of Union Theological Seminary. He has a long list of accomplishments, particularly in the area of social and racial justice. And Doug was actually serving as the interim pastor of First Faith Presbyterian Church at the time of the merger of Faith and First Pres in 1965. And at the same time, he was the clergy coordinator for the state of Pennsylvania for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that was founded by the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Doug, it is so awesome once again. We already have a Zoom meeting with Doug. If you've not seen it yet, it's great. We get a good overview of Doug's life and his calling into ministry and certainly into the area of civil rights. And you can find that on the church website if you'd like to watch that. But today, what we're going to concentrate on is particularly a time frame between 1963 and 1965, and events that occurred not only in Doug's life, but actually have a direct connection to Faith Presbyterian and then ultimately the merger with First Presbyterian. So once again, it is so awesome to have you here. Actually, to be here with you, to have you here, yeah. I'm here as your guest almost, aren't I? And but it's just so good to be with you.
Thank you.
I think we're going to just jump right in here is to talk about very briefly, if we can, what was the draw for you into...
Oh my goodness.
Oh, that must be God calling you.
I'll be back later.
There you go. What was it that drew you into civil rights as a civil rights activist and a concern for civil rights in the early 60s?
Well, I believe I'd have to go back to 1961, 61 actually. My mother was in a car accident right before my graduation. She nearly passed on. I took care of her for, right after graduation, I took care of her for 4 or 5 months till she could get back on her feet. And that changed the course of my life because I was to go to Duke University to attempt to earn a PhD in clinical psychology. Her illness did change the course of my life because she was weekly visited by a clergyman who went to Union Seminary and thought I should go to Union Seminary.
Okay.
And kept working on me until I decided to consider that very seriously. Then, when she was able to get on her own, I took money that I had earned at Colgate, a National Science Foundation scholarship, $2,000, and I took that money and I went with my book Europe on $5 a Day, and I split for Western Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for 9 months. I left at 185 pounds. I came back at 150 because I didn't have much money to pay for food once I got there. So I did a lot of hitchhiking and staying with people. I traveled by myself. It was wonderful, and it was like a 4-year education. Looking at the United States from afar was mind-boggling. There were a lot of really interesting places that were equally as wonderful as the United States, and fascinating places where in Africa, where I was just among blacks and brown-skinned people practicing Islam. And it was a different world over there. So that opened my eyes to race relations. And the following year, when I was first in seminary in 1962, I went to Somalia, which was a very peaceful place. They were just becoming independent. And I was part of a group of 8 athletes under the direction of Sid Hall, who was the head coach at Howard University. We went over there to train their first Olympic team. A fascinating experience. We were given the rank of second lieutenants in their police force. And all the athletes were conscripted onto this Olympic team, and they were made privates and corporals in the police force. So we had total discipline of the team. And they were all Muslims, by the way, and as a result, they didn't drink or smoke. So the only problem we had was that the Quran says, as a Muslim, you're entitled to marry up to 4 women, but you have to treat them equally. And once in a while, a guy would come in late to practice, and I'd say, Abdul, what's your problem? And he'd say, well, coach, I had to treat my wives equally, and that's why I'm late. But that was 1962, living in Africa and a completely black world. Was very exciting, and Africa itself is enormously exciting. Got to travel through a bunch of the countries there before and after our time in Somalia, which led to 1963, when I was finishing up my junior year at Union Seminary. We helped develop a program called the Student Interracial Ministry, which put the black seminarians in white churches wherever they could fit for the summer in the United States, and white seminarians in black churches in the South. And we practiced role-playing, everything, because it was the Jim Crow era. We practiced everything, including taking blows, because our purpose was to go down there non-violently and try and change the laws of segregation in these respective cities. But we practiced lunch counter demonstrations, but always acting peacefully. Those types of things And then in June of '63, I went to Charleston, South Carolina, under the leadership of Reverend Farr, Presbyterian minister, black Presbyterian minister, and Reverend Moore, also a black Presbyterian minister. I was to be the student minister in their two churches. And the night I arrived, Reverend Farr asked me how I felt about civil rights and civil disobedience. And I said, well, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm ready to participate if and when there is any. He said, well, there's going to be some tomorrow, because we're going to have our first march since Reconstruction time in Charleston. And you're going to be part of it. And I want you to wear a collar. And I said, well, I'm just a senior in seminary. I'm not an ordained minister. But he said, you've had enough theological training. Wear the collar, because you're going to be one of the people, you're going to be one of the 12 people that's going to lead this march.
And they wanted you to stand out.
And they wanted me to stand out.
There was no question about who you were.
Yeah, and I kind of stood out anyway among the 300 people that day, because I was the only white person in the movement.
Well, then they'd really want to know, why is that white guy standing there?
Yeah. So I was told I was going to be the 12th person to leave behind the 11 ministers that were organizing the march that day. And that was the beginning of a long, hot, dramatic summer that involved demonstrations every day. We'd be at a different church each morning, and we would organize. The clergy ran the movement there, mostly under the auspices of the NAACP and their legal defense fund, thank God, because they bailed us out of jail constantly. Always thankful to them. And that summer I joined, I became a life member of the NAAC as a sign of my appreciation for getting bailed out regularly and rapidly.
I don't think anybody ever stops to think about the fact, Doug, is that you really did need funding, otherwise you're left in the jail.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't have the money to bail yourself out or get somebody to bail you out,
Right.
you're stuck.
You're stuck.
And I don't think that's something we really think about when protesters are arrested and taken to jail.
True, yeah. So the first day that we marched was one of the most important days of my life. I was scared. We sang hymns. I knew we were going to march down Market Street, the main street in Charleston, and the city wasn't going to be ready for us. There hadn't been any demonstrations in a century, and I was told that there were going to be angry crowds on the sidewalks, and it was going to be a real challenge for us. But we were going to prepare ourselves in the church that morning with some sermons and some speeches by different members of the Charleston 11, as it was at that point. They added me to it after I kind of went through a number of jailings, and they felt I wasn't going to leave.
You had earned your...
I had earned my stripes, I guess, in a way. Very humbling experience.
I'm sure.
But anyway, started off after the prayers and the speeches and a lot of civil rights songs, which girded us all up, and we felt imbued with the spirit of what we were about. And we walked down the steps of this particular church and out into the street, and it was just terrifying, because almost immediately people started coming out of shops on Market Street, mostly white people, but also Charleston was 1/3 black, so a lot of blacks came out of stores as well. And the whites started screaming at us as we started our march. And there was just immediate anger that we were out there demonstrating for equality and the opening of businesses, etc., restaurants and hotels that were all segregated at that point.
Did you sense that there was any additional anger at you because you were obviously the only white man in that group?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
Because
You were a traitor.
I was a traitor to them, and the first person I heard yell at me specifically is, "Hey, white boy, you nigger lover." That's what he yelled at me. Mm-hmm. And then right after that, another person who was standing right next to him said, "We're going to kill you, man." So it was pretty disheartening, and I was scared to begin with, to tell you the truth, and
Why not? It's understandable.
yeah, and that really got my adrenaline pumping, and I thought, boy, I wonder if I should be here. Frankly, I wasn't at all sure that this is what I should be doing, and I thought I've got to get some answers here if possible, and I nervously looked at the minister who was marching in front of me, and I just looked at the back of his neck, or the nape of his neck, and I didn't turn my eyes toward the crowd anymore. I was that nervous, and I started to pray, and I asked God to help me and help me decide what I should do in this instance. You know, should I leave? Should I continue this march? And it was like a voice that came back to me, and God spoke to me in this terrible moment, and said, "Go forward, go forward," and that He will watch over us. And that just lifted the burden off me enormously. Guy, I felt so incredibly relieved, and I remember taking a deep breath and then daring to look out at the crowds that were now getting larger and larger on the sides of the street. People were throwing rocks and picking up dirt and heaving stuff like that at us, and the swearing was getting louder. But as I looked off to the side, I saw a really strange sight, in that some people continued. You could see the boiling anger on their faces, but other people turned away when I looked at them. Wow. As though, they were recognizing some guilt on their part, or maybe a lot of guilt on their part, and they couldn't look me in the face.
Especially looking at a white man
who
was standing with the black people.
Yeah. So that was something I'll never forget. Yeah. And as the march continued, I felt stronger and stronger, and more assured that this was what I was supposed to be doing. And we sang great songs like "Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around," the old Negro spirituals. Yeah. And it was uplifting. And there were kids out there marching that were 6 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, really young kids. And they knew that there was great danger, because it was told to them by the ministers there that morning. But we continued on, and old people as well, people in their 70s and 80s were out in the streets. It was just really dramatic and exciting. We marched the length of the street, then turned around and came back to the church, and nobody was arrested, because I think they were all in shock that first day. And it was a great experience.
And you did, I think you told me, you did have some success eventually before you left Charleston, that some changes came as a result of your being there, not maybe why you were there?
Oh, more than some, but I should just add that the first arrest occurred that afternoon after the march was over.
Oh.
I got arrested.
Oh. Well, they really didn't like you.
They didn't like me much.
They were sending a message to you, weren't they?
Where was that Southern hospitality?
You crossed the line.
I got arrested for I got in my car to leave to go back to Reverend Farr's house, and I just sat down in the car and was starting the engine when a cop car came up alongside me, and the cop got out and came to the window and said, "Get out of the car." And I said, "Why?" And he said, get out of the car. So he got rather loud with me, and so I stepped out of the car, and he said, "You're under arrest." And it blew my mind because I had no idea what I had done except demonstrate. And I thought maybe he was busting me for that. And he said, no, he didn't say no. He just said, "You're under arrest for going through a full stop sign." And I said, "What?
Ow.
I haven't started the car up."
Yeah, really.
And he said, "You've gone through that stop sign. See that one there? You've gone through it." And that was about 100 yards down at the end of the block.
Wow.
But that was good enough for him.
Yep.
And put me in a squad car, took me to jail, fingerprinted me, and I was put in a jail cell with 19 white men. And it was something I will never forget because I remember seeing an old movie that involved going into a jail cell, and if you sat on the wrong person's bunk, you got in big time trouble.
Yeah.
So I waited. It was late afternoon now, and the first thing that happened was they asked me what I was in there for, and I saw a lot of really dangerous looking people,
Yeah.
and I guess that they were in there for all kinds of reasons. So what am I going to tell them? I was in a civil rights demonstration? That would not have worked well at all. So I said, no big deal. I'm in here for no big deal. And they said, "You mean like petty larceny?" And I said, "Yeah, something like that." And with that, that seemed to suffice. And then I waited and waited till way into the evening before I saw that there was one bed left, and it was an upper bed, and that I should be left alone, hopefully. And I took that bed. But there was a plot underway to nail the jailer, who was black. They wanted to attack him. There was an iron doorway with a hatch cut out like this, and they wanted to take a broom that they had attached a razor, the old kind with a handle on it, and they had used a shoestring to tie that on, and they're gonna bang on the door, and then when he opened the hatch, they're gonna jam this through and hit him in the face.
Oh.
And I thought, oh my God, get me out of here. Well, I didn't get out of there that night, but the next morning, thank God, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund got me out, because Reverend Farr was frantic trying to find out where I was.
Say.
And when he found out, he noted the Legal Defense Fund, and they waited. The earliest that they could deal with me was the next morning, and I was released. So anyway, Charleston Summer, to answer your question, was an amazing summer for us. We went from the town being totally segregated to a town that, by marching every day, sitting in the restaurants, going to the department stores and refusing to accept the signs that said white water fountains, black water fountains, white dressing rooms, white women dressing rooms, white male dressing rooms, and then colored dressing rooms without regard to your sex. We got all that changed, and the way we did it was by marching every day and not stopping, and as a result, white people started coming into downtown Charleston less and less because they were fearful of the demonstrations, and black folks were not going into the stores to buy anymore. And when you've got a 35% of your population that's black, business owners were losing money big time. And finally, by the end of the summer, they gave up, and they desegregated all the stores in town. But we also desegregated the public parks that were all segregated, the hotels, the police force, which was all white, promised that it would change within 2 months by hiring black policemen. And within a year, the chief of police was a black officer.
It's, in some ways, it's incredible that that kind of segregation fell that quickly.
It did.
You know what I mean? There's nothing less than almost miraculous.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously economics had a lot.
It played a huge role. We also had some support from the FBI, but we were very careful about them because, first of all, most of the voices that I was hearing were Southerners that would come into our meetings and tell us that there was a definite plot here or there. Same thing in Selma, a year later, where the FBI would come in and tell Dr. King that there's an assassination plot they had uncovered, and he'd go right on with the meeting. But, anyway, we had remarkable success because we just filled up the jails every single day. It was easy to go to jail. It was so easy. If you walked with someone who was of different color than you, you were disturbing the peace. And so I went to jail 9 times that summer, and 8 of them were for disturbing the peace. And one of them was being rude to the manager of a hotel when the 2 pastors and their wives and I went to try and have dinner at one of the restaurants in town. And the manager of the restaurant stopped us at the door and said we weren't welcome. And and he said, "We do not serve Negroes here." And being the brash New Yorker that I intend to be, and using an old Dick Gregory joke that I had learned from watching him do stand-up comedy in one of the comedy clubs, I said in retort to his saying, "We don't serve any Negroes here," I said, "Well, we weren't planning to order any." We weren't planning to order any Negroes. And that was it. The guy got really upset with me, and he slammed the door to it, and he said, "I'm calling the cops." Well, we stood right there at the front door of this restaurant, even though the door was closed on us, and within about 5 minutes, a paddy wagon arrived, and these cops jumped out, and it was demoralizing because they made us sit on the ground, and then they carted us down this short pathway by pulling us on our legs. And these are women
In dresses.
and the 3 of us in our collars.
So they just wanted to humiliate
They
you.
wanted to humiliate us. Yeah, they put us in the back of the paddy wagon, and that arrest was for being rude and crude, and threatening the manager of the hotel. So that was an eye opener. But again, the FBI got us out in about 2 hours. The NAACP, the Defense Fund.
You said that because I want to get to Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Your relationship, because what was it, the Charleston? What you were doing there that came to his attention about you?
Yeah, he knew not about me, but he knew about Charleston because
Okay.
we were making significant progress. I mean, one thing I'll add is that we went as far as trying to desegregate the beach because no black person was allowed on the beach within 40 miles of Charleston in either north or south direction. And we took a group of people and we marched down the beach one day and went in the water and thought we're never going to get out of the water because all the beachgoers who were way descended upon us. But fortunately, we had told the FBI and they formed 2 rows and we got out. So that was making a lot of press, and so Dr. King knew about Charleston. He knew it was now being led by the Charleston 12, that it was an NAACP operation, not an SCLC operation. But it was on the 28th of August when we came pouring out of Charleston to go to the March on Washington. We left the day before, but it was then the next day that I became acquainted with him in a rather strange way. I mean, we had a bunch of the civil rights workers come up from Charleston by train and car. We were just full of excitement and joy that we had brought the city fathers together to create a new way of living down there in just 3 months' time. We had overwhelming success there. And it bore fruit because we could see it in the following years. But we wanted to get to the March on Washington because it was a pivotal march that was going to involve 250,000 people at the mall there in Washington, and the top civil rights speakers were going to be there. So there we were in Mass, and I was with two of the ministers from the Charleston 12, and we listened first to, we listened to a lot of speeches, but right before Martin King spoke, John Lewis spoke, and he gave probably the most fiery speech on the 28th of August. And even then, I found out later, talking to John, that they made him simmer. The other civil rights leaders made him simmer down his speech. They made him write it out, and then they made him alter it somewhat because it was too fiery.
Wow.
But it was still the most fiery speech in my mind. And then it was immediately followed by Dr. King's beautifully eloquent speech. I have a dream speech. Then later, after the whole event was over, there were a lot of people that wanted to see Dr. King and other members of SCLC and the other civil rights leaders. So there were a lot of people trying to get at him, and these two clergymen were both friends of Dr. King's, and so I was really lucky, and really it was a miracle in a way. It was completely unexpected that as I went with these two men to stand in a long line to meet Dr. King, they talked to Dr. King, and in their conversations, he said, well, "Who's the white guy you're with?"
Stood out a little bit, didn't
Did, and they said, "Well, he's the guy who came in from seminary." And Dr. King said, "Well, which seminary?" And they said, "Union Theological in New York City." And he joined us at the beginning of the summer, and he stuck it out. And he went to all the demonstrations and pastored two Presbyterian churches as a student minister. He gave sermons and led the choir in prayers and did all the regular stuff, counseling. But most of the time he was on the streets with us, and he became a member of the 12. And he went to jail 9 times, and Dr. King's eyes lit up. He said, "I got to meet this guy." So that's how it all started.
Wow.
And we had a very short conversation, but it was very warm. He wanted to know what year I was in seminary, and I said, "I'm about to go into my senior year there." And he said, "What do you intend to do?" And I said, "I don't know yet. Union is open to all kinds of possibilities. Maybe I'll go into college teaching, religion and philosophy at college, or I'm not sure. Maybe I'll work for the World Council of Churches because I've now had a lot of international experience, and I'd like to travel more, and I'm just not sure." And he said, "Well, I want to keep in touch with you because you seem like an interesting person who seems dedicated." So we exchanged addresses, and then he said, where did you grow up?" And I said, "In New York," and I grew up in a small town in Pelham, New York, about 12,000 people, and he said, we exchanged addresses, and there was a real strange similarity, a special moment when we looked at the addresses. And my home address back in Pelham I gave him 2 addresses: my student address at Union, and I gave him my home, which was where my mother was living. And he looked at it, and it was 209 Jackson Avenue, where my home address was. And he goes, "Oh my God, 209 Jackson Street, Montgomery. Whoa, this is more than a coincidence." And so we laughed, and he said, "I'll be in touch with you. I'm I'm going to check on you, and you can call me anytime. So that's how we met. And
Don't you think he was fascinated too? Because at that time in civil rights, whites weren't very involved in it.
No.
It was really had to be run by our black brothers and sisters themselves. They were
Absolutely.
the ones pushing.
Yeah, the movement, for the most part, was run by black ministers. Life evolved around the churches, the black churches in those days, and that's the way it was. But of course, the March on Washington showed that there was other elements too, like the brotherhood of the union workers,
Right.
that type of thing. CORE was represented, Congress of Racial Equality, NAACP, SCLC, SNCC. But yeah, the towns.
The March on Washington, it was really starting to gain a lot of momentum.
It
The
was.
civil rights movement.
It was, and there were, there were a whole lot of people from different religions and colors that came to the March on Washington. It wasn't just a black march
Yeah.
at all. So, yeah, things were starting to really pick up. In '63.
And for whether it was then or a little later on, MLK was also emphasizing economic equality, or at least equity.
Mhm.
The Poor People's March
The Poor People's March, really important.
and all of that
Yeah.
became more important.
Yeah. And the war in Vietnam was brewing in the background.
Right.
And he was a really strong advocate of stopping the war. And that grew and grew and grew until he was murdered in 1968.
Right.
Same with Dick Gregory, by the way,
Yes.
who I had the fortune of being his roommate down in Selma. Gregory is known as a civil rights activist, but he was also very much an anti-war activist for the same reasons King was. He said, Dr. King said, what good is it? Those are his exact words. What good is it to desegregate a lunch counter, a luncheonette at a Woolworths, a five and dime place that's got a lunch counter that we can finally eat in, if the milk our children are drinking at that lunch counter has strontium 90 in it. Part of the bombs that we dropped on the Vietnamese people, and Dick Gregory was the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And he Dick Gregory ended up not only going to jail over 100 times, but going without food, only water and juices, as he ran across the United States. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
At one point, Gregory got to be about 280 pounds,
Mm-hmm.
and by the time he had crossed the United States and back in basically a fast for 14 months, he weighed 98 pounds.
Oh, Lord.
I mean, talk about
Survived it.
dedication.
Wow.
Yeah, talk about dedication. Oh, there's more we could talk about with Dick Gregory.
Yeah. So you went back to Union because you had to graduate. You did have to do some studies so that you could get your
Yeah.
Master of Divinity.
Yeah.
And so you get contacted by the National Church
Yeah.
about this black congregation in York, Pennsylvania.
Well, yes, but before that, part of Union Seminary, there are several seminaries within Union Seminary. In those days, there was Auburn Seminary built inside of Union Seminary, which was for Presbyterian students.
Okay.
And I came out of a Presbyterian background
Right.
through my parents and my teenage years when I went to Huguenot Memorial Church in Pelham, New York. So Auburn said, you need to go and get an application from 475 Riverside Drive, which is where the National Presbyterian Church had their headquarters.
I was there years ago
Yeah,
when it existed.
yeah. So, that's just around the corner. So, so one day I went over there and I got an application, and they said, fill it out, and then we will disseminate your application around, and we'll see if you get any bites anywhere. And so I filled out the application and name, address, colleges. I also went to Columbia while I was at Union.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was a fellow in international affairs at Columbia.
Oh, okay.
They took 2 students from Union, and it was a great program, but that's another time.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that. And I filled out the application, and they wanted to know what my recent activities had been.
What you been doing for the
You
summer?
know, and things besides what your grade point average was and what your transcript would be
Right.
and all that stuff. So, you know, I put down that recently I had helped coach an Olympic team in Somalia that was planning to go to the Olympics in Tokyo in 1964.
Oh,
How ironic, because we're in the middle of the
Yes,
Olympics
how ironic.
right now, again in Tokyo. And that year before, I had gone to 23 countries in 9 months, based on some money I had earned at Colgate. And in '63, I had become a member of the Charleston 12, and had gone to jail 9 times. And so that was
nothing else.
yes, that was my application. and, and by the way, there was no request for pictures in that application, which is an interesting point, because eventually that application found its way to York, Pennsylvania, and to the session of Faith Presbyterian Church. And they looked at that and they said to themselves, this guy is worth looking at. He's a life member of the NAACP. How can we go wrong?
They made a lot of assumptions,
They
didn't
made a lot of assumptions.
Oh well, God has a strange sense of humor.
Yeah,
doesn't he?
very strange sense of humor. Absolutely. Yeah, so I did get a call to come down and be interviewed by the session. I didn't know, how definitive that call was, but they said, come down, we want to take a look at you.
Little did they know
Little
what it
did
meant.
they know what that look was going to be. And I arrived at the church, and the session was in operation, and I walked in the door.
They thought the wrong person came in.
Absolutely jaws dropped. It was really funny, and my jaw was dropping too, because I was nervous. I think I said in that Zoom broadcast that I was just worried that they're going to ask me all kinds of theological questions, and they didn't. They were just interested in, well, what's this guy about? And we've got your application. We see that you did all this stuff, but we don't know some things that some of our members are really interested in. And I said, well, like what? Shoot, go ahead, ask the questions. And and so the first question, or I don't remember now what I said the other day, or when we talked on the Zoom, but they had 3 questions, and one of them was, do you drink? And I said, yes, I drink very moderately. I have a beer once in a while, or a glass of wine once in a while, but I'm not much of a drinker because I'm an athlete. And so they were okay with that answer. And they said, do you smoke? And at that time I was smoking a pipe. Okay. And I guess I was hung up on my academic image a little bit.
There you go, yeah.
So they said, well, you don't have a problem with that? And I said, well, I don't inhale. And well, did you ever smoke cigarettes? And I said, yeah, I did till I was in my early 20s, but because of sports, I had to give that up. And they were satisfied with that answer too. And then they said, now this is an important third question. do you dance? And I thought, these are really strange questions, but the prior minister had been a Baptist, and he didn't believe in any of those three things.
Mhm.
So when I said, yes, I love to dance, they started roaring. They thought this is great. And they were laughing, and they really relaxed me. And they told me that my predecessor had been a Baptist minister, and he didn't believe in these things. He thought they were sinful. So,
Yeah,
in some ways, they were walking on eggshells.
yes.
And so this guy comes along, and he's okay with that stuff. So, there was a big sigh of relief. And they never asked me any theological questions. They did ask me about my jail experiences and why I joined the NAACP, and I said out of great gratitude and out of success that they had in getting us out of jail, and success that our group of people in Charleston had in basically liberating a city that had long been the heart of the South, and it was really encouraging. And I look forward to taking what I had learned and applying that in my training in the union and doing the best job I could as the interim minister of faith, if you'll have me.
But you were aware of the fact, correct me if I'm wrong, at that point, that faith was struggling.
Yes, I was aware.
And that the national church really saw the need that this congregation was going to need to merge with another congregation.
Yeah, but I wasn't totally confident that they would accept me down there, so
Right.
I went with an open mind that I could be taking a quick trip back to New York.
But they knew that whoever they called was also going to be seeking to do that. I mean, they were aware that this is not new to them.
No, this was not new to them.
Right.
And the national church said that Faith Church was struggling. They had limited financial resources. Right. You wouldn't be getting much of a salary. They told me what it was going to be. You want me to tell you what it was or not?
Oh, I don't care.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure it wasn't much.
No, they said you'll be lucky to get $6,000
Oh, I
a
remember
year.
you did tell me that.
Yeah. And they said you'll get $60 allowance a month to find a place for yourself. And I did. Subsequently, I found a third floor that was being rented out by a shoemaker. Had a little shoe shop on South George Street, not far from Boundary, where Cleo Carr and family lived. And
Yes.
Cleo was our soloist, and his wife was the organist at Faith Church. And Sharon, who was a little kid at the time, became a 40-year teacher in high school, special ed. And Bradley went on to be a football player at the University of Maryland, and I used to carry both those kids over my shoulders when I was the pastor there. But getting back to the national church for a second, they said they were pretty sure that you would find some open arms down there that would welcome you, and we have specific things that we would like you to do. One was to be the regular pastor of the church, all the duties and responsibilities that a Presbyterian minister would have, including marriages, divorces, or the whole gamut, hospital visitations, etc., counseling, what have you. And but secondly, we have a specific hope in mind. We would like you to do a sociological study of the town of York, and specifically look into the 7 or 8 Presbyterian churches that were in the vicinity, either in York or surrounding towns, and examine them by having good talks with their clergy and with their congregations, members of their congregation, and ascertain whether there might be the possibility of an interracial merger with one of these churches. And I went, wow, that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big challenge. They said at the time that there were only 2 interracial mergers of churches in the United States. And
That was of any denomination or Presbyterian?
I believe it was any denomination.
Any denomination. Okay.
But I'm not certain of that. But that's,
Well, that would make sense. It would be
Back in
unusual
those
if it was,
days.
yeah, it would be unusual if it was actually 2 other Presbyterian churches that
Yeah.
emerged.
yeah, I think it was definitely the first Presbyterian church. But I'm not certain of that. But that's what they told me.
Close enough.
So they said, we hope that there's a church out there that will be open enough and humble enough and godlike enough to open their arms to a merger.
Yeah.
They said it's a big task for you, and it's going to take many months, but that's your sideline. That's the other part of your ministry to be down there.
Don't you think, in a way, Doug, I was just thinking about being a good Presbyterian and believing in the providence of God. The fact that you were white, but that you were also so involved in the civil rights movement. I mean, you had won your stripes, as we've already concluded. That when you came to this struggling black congregation, because you were white, but you also had shown your heart by your commitment to civil rights, that they could trust you, knowing that all the other Presbyterian churches were white.
Yeah.
So if they were going to merge, they were going to merge with a white congregation.
Yeah.
They really needed to trust the person, i.e. you, that was going to take them through that process and help them choose the right congregation, and help them make that decision.
Yeah.
And if you had been African American, it may have been a different story, but you were like a bridge between those 2 worlds. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Sure. I'm sure there were a few people who were skeptical, when I arrived.
Sure.
That's bound to happen. But I think my experience came through pretty quickly, because I had to, besides demonstrating every day, I had to go back and also be the student minister at these 2 Presbyterian churches in Charleston.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of experience learning how to deal with amen corners,
Okay.
which Presbyterian churches don't basically have,
No.
whether they're black or white. And but in the South, it was especially different. And I can remember the first week I was in Charleston, and I was told by the pastor that before the Sunday service, your job will be to pray with the choir.
Yeah.
And I stood with the choir, and I started to pray that we would be able to lift our voices up and in joy to the Lord, and the next thing I know, I'm hearing, "Amen, brother."
That's right.
And I looked up from my prayer. Who's disturbing this prayer? I had to learn what a great thing this is,
Yes, it is.
in prayer, and to learn about the Amen corner. And we had one at Faith Church, even
Did
though
you?
we were
Did you?
Presbyterian, because there were a number of people at Faith that came out of Baptist
Yes.
and AME backgrounds, and
Right.
so they couldn't break the habit. Even if they might have even been half asleep on a Sunday morning, they're going to yell out, "Amen, brother," and keep it going. And and it was wonderful. I mean, I wish white churches did that more, because it's great.
We're trying it first, but let me tell you, you get some looks every once in a while.
Well, for sure. But it is so helpful to a pastor to get that feedback. Now, some of it, some of it may be a guy who's sleeping it off from a Saturday night.
Right.
And he come, "Well, Pastor." But for the most part, it's very sincere,
Yes.
and it really helps.
Yeah.
And I loved it. So
And it is part of our black brothers and sisters culture.
absolutely.
But we can't
Yeah.
miss that and say that.
Oh yeah.
Somewhere in before you accepted the call, if I'm correct, you consulted with Martin Luther King about going in?
I sure did. 2 or 3 times.
Oh, okay.
Because when I first filled out the application, I talked to him and I asked him, what I should put down here. I said,
I've been arrested on several occasions.
Yeah, and I said, is that going to hurt my chances of getting a job?
Yeah, you have a criminal record, do
He said, stand up tall and be proud.
Okay.
Of that, that there's no crime in being arrested.
Yeah.
and you should wear that as a badge of honor. He said, I didn't get arrested 9 times in '63. So I went ahead and put it down. So that's the first time I talked to him. And then I talked to him once before. I said, I'm not hearing anything. And he said, something will come. Something will come along. And then shortly after the call came, and I told him what the National Church wanted me to do. And he said, whoa, that's really interesting.
Okay.
Really interesting, the possibility of merging churches along racial lines. That is very interesting.
Especially when he said that Sunday morning was the most segregated time in America.
That's right. That's right.
So that would speak
Yeah.
to him.
So that really lit him up, and he said, I think you should go for it. Now, you may not have any luck with these churches. I mean, they can be pretty bad because you're so close to the Mason-Dixon line. I think it's 35 miles, he said, or something like that.
That's 17 miles.
17
from York.
miles.
Yeah, from York to the Mason-Dixon line.
17 miles. Oh, he said 35.
Yeah, no, it's even closer.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I came to realize that when I got there.
Well, York, with all due respect,
Yeah.
York has been called the Alabama of the North.
Oh, my God. I never
Oh,
heard
yeah,
that.
York has had a long
Oh.
history.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I knew when I got there that the Klan was a big issue in New York.
Yes, it was very big.
issue. And
Yes.
something I had to face directly with them. But yeah, so I actually talked with Dr. King about 3 times before I came,
And
he was encouraging.
that is so awesome. And that, before we started, I told you I wanted to help people at First Presbyterian, i.e. and Faith, although I suspect our Faith brothers and sisters were aware of this much more than many of our white brothers and sisters at first. The connection that you had with King
Mhm.
and this decision that you made,
Mhm.
that he was helpful to you
Yeah.
in that whole process as you went through it. This was not just a passing relationship that you had with King. It was a trusting relationship
Yeah.
that would then grow. I want to stop right there.
Mhm.
This is remember I warned you? I said,
Oh, yes.
we will find a place that makes sense to stop
Mhm.
and consider this to be the first part of a 2-part episode,
Okay.
is how you actually came to faith. Because then what we want to do is then we're going to go on to the next part of the story, and that has to do with Selma.
Uh-huh.
So we're going to stop here. And for part 1, I'm sure you've been as fascinated with me. I have heard Doug talk about this numerous times, different parts of his life. Every time I listen to him, I learn something new about you, Doug. I hear nuances of your story, and particularly the connection with faith and therefore First Presbyterian. And it's an incredible story. So we know that you all have enjoyed it, but we're going to stop here. And so we thank you for being with us, and we wish you grace and peace in our Lord Jesus Christ.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away.